we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time listening, welcome. If not, welcome back. Like I always say, if you want to reach us, please hit us up on our Instagram or our Twitter at the Bigmark Pod, at the Bigmark Podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe to our channel so you know when our next video comes out. Wherever you're listening, please give us a 5-star review if you like the podcast. I know it doesn't sound like much, but it really helps. And if you ever want to support the podcast, please do at our Patreon, patreon.com/thebigmarkpod. I was just watching this great new series on HBO. It was on Crave, and I was just streaming it, and it was tremendous. I kind of got into it a little bit on a whim. I didn't really know too much about it. I kind of saw the cast and was like, man, this is unreal. And so I started watching it, and I just couldn't get enough of it. I ate it up, and I just finished watching the last episode and started up this podcast. So I'm fresh into it. I just finished it, and it was really good. And that series is Winning Time, The Rise of the Lakers Dynasty. So it's obviously about the LA Lakers, the basketball team. And it was created by Max Bornstein. And it's based on the Showtime era Lakers. So Magic, Kareem, all those guys there. And the most of the plot of the show is based on the book Showtime, Magic, Kareem, Riley, and the LA Lakers Dynasty of the 1980s, by Jeff Pearlman. Really interesting book. I've heard of it. I've never actually read it. I definitely want to check that one out, though, but that seems really interesting. It's interesting with true stories, right? Like, especially with books. I get into this a little bit more about actual biopics and movies about stuff that's real. But the stories behind it, and if you have a good author that tells the story really well, it can be pretty special. The show premiered on March 6, 2022, and the pilot was actually directed by Adam McKay, the same guy who directed from Anchorman, The Big Short, Don't Look Up. So really, really, really interesting there. It has a really cool feel, the show, there's just like, obviously it's a period piece, so it's set in the early 80s, but I think with technology and things getting better and better, and again, I'll touch on this later in this podcast, things are getting better, like representations of stories. Again, I think I mentioned this in podcasts of late. Now that things are happening, historically speaking, I mean, I guess things that happened in the 90s was basically 30 years ago. So, as the time changes, we can look back and still be fascinated, because I heard a scary fact, the 60s were to the 90s what the 90s are to today. So that whole feeling where, you'd watch in the 90s, you'd watch a movie, when it was set in the 60s, ooh, cool, groovy. That, seemed so much longer, that 30 years was so much different from the 90s to the 60s than it is to today. It seems. It's obviously the exact same length of time, but I just mean like the feel of it. It's a long time ago. It doesn't feel like a long time ago, and things haven't really changed as much drastically. Obviously from the 60s to today is like night and day. But again, without, I guess the late 90s, the internet was kind of coming out, but like cell phones and social media, basically everything else is the same. But we have so much more like data, I guess you could say, there's so much more video, and there's so much more information, and some of the people are still alive and can tell the stories. So I feel like whether it's books or whether it's movies or what TV or whatever, they're all doing a much better job at actually representing these stories, which I think is fascinating. It's also weird doing like representing characters and playing parts, especially for the actors, but anybody even writing the stories, thinking about these people that are still alive and can be like, yo, man, I didn't do any of this shit. I don't know what the fuck you're talking about. Anyway, like I said, the show follows the 1980s. Wow. The show follows the 1980s Showtime era of the LA Lakers. So, Magic Johnson, Kareem, Mike Cooper, there's tons of guys on that team that were super stellar and really strong. And, the show also talks a lot about, obviously, the Celtics being the LA's biggest rival and Larry Bird. And it's really interesting. I'll get into that later, but the character that they choose to play Larry Bird the actor that they choose to play Larry Bird is really interesting. Some of the cast in the show, because it's a tremendous cast. Like I said, when I first started getting into the show, I realized who's in the cast, and I was like, I got to check this out. So, John C. Reilly is in it, as we know from Step Brothers and Boogie Nights. He plays the Lakers owner, Jerry Buss. Quincy Isaiah plays Magic Johnson. This is kind of his first big acting gig, but he's really good. He's actually from Michigan, so it's funny. He gets the accent really well. Jason Clarke plays Jerry West. He was in First Man and Zero Dark 30. Adrian Brody, as we know from The Pianist and French Dispatch, he plays Pat Riley, the Lakers coach. Jerry West was the former Lakers coach, but I guess the GM. Anyway, he's involved. Gabby Hoffman plays Claire Rothman. Gabby Hoffman was actually the little girl in Uncle Buck, which is hilarious. She does a really good job. Tracy Letts as Jack McKinney. Jack McKinney is the original coach of the team, of the Lakers, and he has... I guess it's not a spoiler alert because it's a true story, but if you haven't seen the show, he has a bike accident and has to leave the team. But he was in The Big Short and Ford versus Ferrari. This is probably the one guy who really caught my eye, and I mean, apart from John C. Reilly, that is. But Jason Segel plays Paul Westhead, who is the interim coach of the Lakers after Gabby Hoffman. Or sorry, oh my God. Paul Westhead is the interim head coach after Jack McKinney gets injured, and then Pat Riley becomes the interim head coach at one time, and this is what actually happens in real life when Paul Westhead gets kidney stones. It's interesting. Today I'm going to kind of talk about the show a little bit and kind of talk about what was actually happening in real life, because obviously, that's how the show works. Solomon Hughes does an excellent job playing Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. It's his first credit that I could find in my research, and he does a really, really good job. I'll go into it a little bit more. It's interesting with casting. Not everyone's going to be identical look-alike. It's probably hard to find someone who looks exactly like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar because he has a pretty specific look. Sally Fields plays Jessie Buss, who is Jerry Buss's mother, and she helps Major with the team. Obviously, we know Sally Fields from Mrs. Doubtfire and Forrest Gump. She's tremendous in the show, and yeah, she does a really, really good job. Michael Chiklis plays Red Auerbach, who's the owner of the Boston Celtics. He's from, obviously, The Shield and Fantastic Four. Sean Patrick Small as Larry Bird. That's one of his first credits that I could find as well. And then Wood Harris plays Spencer Haywood. And we know Wood from Remember the Titans and The Wire. And he does a really interesting job. He has a really interesting storyline. I mean, it's funny I'm sure with coming up with the show and the writers coming up with the show, it's hard to decide on which stories you're going to tell. Obviously, you got to talk, like, they're talking about the Lakers as a whole. It follows Jerry Buss a lot, talks about their owner quite a bit with John C. Reilly, playing things out and just all the happenings that he had to do to make the team, Jerry Buss had to do to make the team. But obviously a lot of it is about Magic Johnson too, because he's just such an integral part of the team and everything. And, what's happening in the coaching staff. And then, you got like 15 players to choose from. You can go anywhere down the line and follow them. And you really have to kind of choose the two big guys, right? So you have to choose Kareem and you have to choose Magic. So some of the other guys on the team, they probably had some really interesting stories too. But Spencer Haywood has a really somewhat tragic story, but again, really interesting. You can check it out. I'm sure there's history about his actual real story if you don't want to watch the show, but watch the show. Again, Wood Harris does a fantastic job. Again, I mentioned it before, but excellent casting. I think, it's for most of the athletes and players and characters and actors and actresses. The casting directors seem to choose a lot of unknown people, and I think that's interesting because you want to choose people that at least somewhat resemble the real life characters. I guess it's always tough when you have to pick someone who can act. I guess if they look just like them, it's bonus. Like the guy who played Brian May from Bohemian Rhapsody, and a few times there's been moments of casting glory where they actually found someone who was a perfect representation of what a real person looked like, right? But again, do you choose acting chops? In the People versus O.J. Simpson, that American crime story season, Cuba Gooding Jr. played O.J. Simpson, and he doesn't really look like O.J., and he's probably 6 to 10 inches shorter than him, legit. O.J.'s a big, huge dude. He was bigger than all his lawyers, and Cuba Gooding Jr. was smaller than everyone who played anyway. So there has to be a suspension of disbelief. It's still television, still Hollywood. It's not perfect. So you got to still kind of look at it with an open mind and say, okay, this isn't the fucking person. So, that's how it's going to be. You're going to go, oh, okay, the person is acting. Duh. But when they can hit gold and find an actor that really looks like them, and the actor does a good job, portraying their mannerisms, and maybe there's some makeup involved and some effects. Again, what they can do today is just fantastic with making these characters look like these guys, sound like them. Jamie Foxx is probably one of the best for sounding just like Ray Charles, and he actually sang all the parts too. So with hard work on both ends from the casting directors and the actors themselves, you can get some really, really interesting stuff. And like I mentioned before, really interesting to portray a person who's still alive. I wonder what Jerry West thought of the portrayal, or what Kareem thought, or what Magic thinks of his portrayals in the show, right? So I think the direction of the show is really cool, how the filmmakers actually, choose how things are made. As I mentioned, Adam McKay directed the first one, the pilot episode. Jonah Hill directed episode 2. There's kind of this cool effect that they do where, when, I guess this is an effect kind of used in movies already, but they usually splice in old newsreel or actually old footage from that time period to give the scene kind of more of a real effect. I guess it doesn't happen all the time, but you can kind of imagine this, that inserting this old film kind of gives the scene more of a authentic feel. And what they kind of did is they kind of just put an effect on one of the camera angles that made it look grainy and look like the film was from the 70s or the 80s. So that gives it a really interesting effect. They don't do it too much. They don't do it ad nauseum, but when they do it, it's well done, and it's such a, again, it just gives the scene a feeling of authenticity, even though it's the same characters. And I think it's always interesting when you're gonna make a biopic, and now you're gonna have to reshoot famous, especially with athletes, you're gonna have to reshoot famous Sports Illustrated covers, or you're gonna have to reshoot famous posters, or things like that, right? So again, I think they did a really good job at kind of making it feel authentic, the whole show, I think. They also do this really cool trick, sometimes at the beginning of the show, and then sometimes after act breaks and stuff. But they'll, after the credits run, the opening credits, there'll just be like a flash of a scene. And sometimes it's a flash of like a scene that already happened. And then sometimes it's a flash of a scene that's already going to happen. So it's really, really cool how they do that effect. It's a little bit of a foreshadowing kind of thing, which is super cool. And I think that they do this. I think that they do this in other shows and like I said, biopics. Like, I feel that with new technology, they can kind of use like almost like, what's that, like face app kind of thing that one dude does those weird like Tom Cruise impressions with on Instagram. It's like the face sync, or what the hell does they call it? Anyway, it like you can like just superimpose someone else's face on yours, and it like moves perfectly how you talk and how you make your own expressions, and it's like just like a filter basically. Like, I wonder if they kind of do like a movie style version of that, where they do kind of like, not all the time, but in certain scenes they kind of tweak that, or again they superimpose certain things, or they tweak old footage to kind of make it look like it's a real person, because they did a really good job. Like, there's some scenes, especially when they're actually playing basketball, where you're like, holy shit, that actually looks like Magic Johnson. This guy actually kind of moves like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Like, it's super fucking cool. They actually do like some cool little side plots about Kareem and kind of talk about his life, before, and his kind of struggles, kind of coming out of the 70s into the 80s. I'll touch on that and what that was kind of like for the NBA, but it's really interesting. And in fact, they talk about in the show, but Kareem Abdul-Jabbar actually means instrument of God, which I think is really interesting. He's kind of reminded of his faith a lot in the show, and it seems to be tested a lot as an athlete at that time, where things were kind of transitioning from professional athletes were doing it just for sport into things were kind of starting to transition into there's more celebrity involved and more fame and things like that. You can't really talk about the 1980s Lakers without talking about the Celtics. Like I mentioned before, the Celtics and the Lakers had a mean rivalry. I have this huge Celtics banner in the studio. It's kind of weird talking about just the Lakers, but again, a fascinating time. And, I did a great podcast. If you guys haven't seen it, go check it out, on Magic and Bird, which is a great documentary, but it talks a lot about obviously the state of everything in the NBA and how Magic Johnson and Larry Bird, coming into the league kind of gave there was this big push of, Magic being the city, flashy Hollywood kind of guy from LA, and then Larry Bird being the kind of country white boy from Boston. And, they essentially kind of like reinvigorated the NBA, but, in the show, and I think that the filmmakers are doing this on purpose, they do a really interesting representation of Larry Bird. And, Larry Bird is known to be surly. He wasn't interested in doing interviews with newspapers and things like that. I don't know how rude he was about things, but again, like I said, it sounded like he was a really tough mofo on the court. And the show and Sean Patrick Small, who plays Larry, does a pretty good job of making him seem like a major dick. And it's interesting. I think they're setting him up, and if you haven't seen the podcast, go check it out. Or if you haven't seen the documentary Magic and Bird, go check that out too. But I talk a lot about, Magic and Bird had such an interesting relationship where they were bitter rivals, but they were also like virtual doppelgangers on the court. They identical games. They were more interested. They weren't more interested in getting their own points. They were interested in spreading things out and giving things and being unselfish and playing defense and bringing a whole new attitude to the NBA that at the time was kind of dwindling. People didn't really care about it as much, and players had a different attitude. They were more interested in just getting their points and getting their shit done and getting getting their fame and fortune before the team and before winning championships. But Larry and Magic really changed that for the NBA. And I think the filmmakers are just kind of setting that up by making Larry a big dick because, spoiler warning, and I hope they do a justice in the show, Larry and Magic become like best friends. And it's a really, truly touching and sweet friendship. And it's a very cool story of how they were rivals and did become friends. And I hope the show, it did get renewed for a second season. I hope the show continues on and does it justice. Because that's a really cool story and I think it deserves being told. Another thing I want to talk about, it's hard doing sports movies. It's hard doing a sports show, but anything that's obviously based off a real story. It's hard doing a sports movie, because you have to represent the sports. You have to show them the characters in the show playing the sport. And sometimes it's hard because maybe some of the actors don't actually know how to play the sport. So you don't want them out there like looking like absolute knobs, I'm sure. So that's something you kind of have to work around. I think there's a scene like potentially from Twilight or something where there's this guy who's supposed to be the quarterback of the football team and he's throwing absolute ducks with some sidearm action. Sorry, just choking on coffee. Anyway, so, you have to kind of get actors that are relative athletes or at least can look in the moment like athletes on camera. But you have your Blue Mountain States or whatever where it's like completely fictional and you do your thing there. But when you're trying to do an actual real story, you got to kind of get athletes. These guys are real superior athletes. They did fantastic, amazing things on the field and the court and whatever you want to call it. And if you don't really do justice to them, it's going to look weird. And if you don't represent them as you should, it's going to be strange viewing. Let's just put it that way. Friday Night Lights, I think the movie was a tremendous job. It did absolutely great job at portraying kind of what it was like for football. Goon is a great sports movie, one of my favorite movies. Shout out Danny Purcell. I always love that movie and bug him about that, but really good representation of a team and how things work together. I've talked about movies that, are great representations of bands, and Bohemian Rhapsody was one of them I talked about already, but it did a good job at kind of showing about what it's like to be in a band and the interaction and everything like that. But I think Winning Time does a really good job at that as well. I think overall, again, it's a hard task, but I think they do a really good job. They picked good actors that portray these athletes and they get along in a certain fashion. Remember the Titans is also another tremendous movie. Speaking of Wood Harris, like I mentioned, he was in Remember the Titans, another great sports movie. So Wood Harris, you're killing it in the sports movies. And then obviously in any biopic, there's liberties with the plot. And I think that that's always a bit of an issue because there's certain times where you're like, this is a closed room. This is a closed conversation between two people. Unless one of these people told you exactly what happened, how could you possibly know what they said? Especially if there's two people that are speaking were dead. Or, again, I get that you can imagine things and you can add things to the plot, of course, but it would suck being, especially like I said, if there's people alive still that are being represented in the movie, it would suck watching the movie, being one of those people and going like, man, this is not exactly how it went down. Like, that would be really annoying. So I guess you have to be careful, but then at the same time, there's room for artistic interpretation. Right? And adding to it only adds to the emotions, and it highlights how these characters or these real people would have actually felt in the moment. The show's obviously set in the late 80s into the early, set in the late 70s and into the early 80s. It was a different era of basketball. Like I mentioned before, interest in the NBA was dwindling. The 1979 Ncaa Final actually had like twice as many viewers as the NBA Final that year. And that was actually where Magic and Larry played against each other. The Indiana State Sycamores played Michigan State Spartans, and Michigan State beat Indiana, and Magic won the NCAA Final. He won a state championship like a couple years before, and then he won with the Lakers. Again, spoiler alert, it's real, so whatever. Won a championship with the Lakers like in his rookie year, I guess. So all within like 3 years, he won the best fucking trophies you can win for basketball in the States. But essentially the way that the NBA and legit David Stern, who was the NBA commissioner up until fairly recently, they basically put Magic and Johnson. They put Magic and Larry against each other and created this whole narrative, this whole Luke Skywalker versus Darth Vader kind of thing. And, city versus country and all that kind of thing. So they really made it interesting, and a lot of stuff that they changed, a lot of rules they made. And, again, there's interesting insights in the show where they talk about, we'd make a lot more money if these series went a little bit if they were a little bit longer, these 7-game series, if they went to game 7, that's 2 or 3 more games that we'd have, stuff like that. So you start to think like the business involved with these teams, trading and this and that and this. It's kind of shady, some of the shit that goes down with other human lives, that is. But again, at one point in the show, Magic is negotiating a contract and he's trying to get $100,000 a year, versus today's rookie contracts are starting at $900,000 a year. And that's like a starting rookie. Like, who knows about like Zion Williamson or like some like number one, money recruit. They're making mad dough. It was a different era of basketball, and it was also a different era of society. You obviously had Boston versus LA. You had a lot of really heavy duty racial shit going on there, which is terrible. But it went down. The show does a pretty good job at talking about that. And Jerry Buss, the owner, is kind of like a classic playboy type dude, and his behavior with the ladies is very highlighted in the show. And again, it was a different era, and again, it's John C. Reilly playing Jerry Buss, so he's really good. He had some great humor in there. But John C. Reilly's a tremendous actor, and it's interesting the way the filmmakers have portrayed Jerry. Anyone who has that, I'll do whatever it takes to be successful, even if it costs me my friends and family, it's hard to relate. This happens a lot to people who are perceived to be successful and perceived to be great. But again, it's an interesting take, on that whole pioneering businessman kind of thing. Great things can be done, but do they have to kind of cost you everything? Who knows, right? Maybe to some people, and maybe sometimes it comes easy to others. Who knows, right? Like, it's really hard to say. But the way John C. Reilly does portray Jerry Buss is, again, there's a kind of a sad clown element to it, and he does whatever he can. And Sally Field does a great job as his mother, and Jeannie Buss, who is Jerry Buss's daughter, is involved too. And there's some really interesting scenes where they're kind of talking about, they have to support Jerry because he's fragile, and that's how all men are. And it's an interesting point. Sometimes we need to be lifted up, and sometimes we need that support. even though we act all tough and act all like playboys and stuff like that. Like I mentioned before, the show is renewed for a second season, so I'm really excited to see what they do. The first season ends with LA winning their first title, and they go on to win a bunch. They go on to play against Boston a few more times, and it's really interesting where they're going to go with the story. I'm super excited. I hope they keep doing it. And I'll kind of leave you with this one last thought. Biopics of any kind, whether it's sports or otherwise, have importance because, we can get to do at least, when we watch them, we get to at least imagine, where these characters of history were, what they were kind of thinking. We can kind of at least put ourselves in those situations a little bit more, feel like we're inside it, where there's the darkest hour with Gary Oldman as Winston Churchill. You finally think, oh my God, these moments in history that happen, they are cinematic. There's so much story and there's so much info and juicy information that's in there, and it needs to be told to people, and people need to understand that. And I think people need to understand that because there's something to be learned from these characters in history, because they're being put in real life scenarios. And yeah, maybe it's the fucking NBA championship, but there's something about that human experience and understanding that these are just athletes and they're going through things and they're people too. And we raise them up on pedestals and how much that affects them too, and fame and life and their job and all those different things that are involved in these real life scenarios. We finally can, it's closer to home than something that's complete fiction. Let's just put it that way. Of course, filmmakers will take liberties with the biopics, but again, it's to highlight those emotions. It's to put you more in. So try not to, like I do sometimes, try not to overanalyze when they take things to a different place. I think the last thing I want to say is, I think if we imagine along with these characters and we put ourselves in those situations, I think if we understand them more, maybe we can strengthen our own understanding of the universe and how things work. So go check out this show, Winning Time. Go check out another biopic. Find out more information about the 1980s Lakers. Is super cool. Again, I hope that second season comes out super soon. I'm really excited to see how they do. It's an awesome story, and again, I think it's something special about that, and I can't wait till they keep making more shows like this. HBO never really misses people, so go check it out. Thanks for listening. Again, if you have a chance, if you like the podcast, please give us a 5-star review wherever you're listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe to the podcast, or to our channel, so that you never miss a video that we drop. Please reach out to the podcast if you ever want to listen, or if you ever want to hear a podcast on a certain topic. Please let us know. Please reach out on our Instagram or Twitter at the Bigmark Podcast, at the Bigmark Pod. And if you want to support the podcast, please hit us up on our Patreon, patreon.com/the Bigmark Pod. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you soon. Beat LA. Peace.